Hello, everybody. My name is Paul. I'm one of the librarians at Thomas Crane Public Library, and I'm excited to be here tonight to host, well, not host, but to present the host of our program tonight, Historical Significance of St. Peter, with Sean Murphy. Sean's one of our returning champions, always bringing something great to our presentations here at the library. And I also want to take a moment to thank the Friends of the Thomas Crane Public Library because of all they do. They help bring programs like this to us. So we definitely want to thank them. And I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Sean.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So, good evening, everybody. You're very welcome. And even though it's not the day yet, I won't see you on the day. So, happy St. Patrick's Day to you. So, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to give you some history about St. Patrick and his times, and I'm going to go into some detail about what Ireland was like at the time, how St. Patrick came to Ireland to begin with, and uh, what his life was like, really a kind of a biography. I'm going to talk about why he returned to Ireland, and then I'm going to look at his legacy. Obviously, I can only cover a small amount in a presentation like this. I am at the moment doing in March a 4 week course which has already started. But if any of you are interested, I'll be giving you a contact for me later on. So with that being said, let's see, 7:02. Yeah, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up a PowerPoint presentation, and then you can follow me on that. If any of you would like to get a copy of the presentation, just take my email down when towards the end there's a slide, and if you contact me, I will let you have a copy of it. So here we go. Okay, so you all should see a slide here. It begins with a quote from one of the writings of St. Patrick. The writings that we have of St. Patrick are some of the earliest writings that we have from Ireland. There isn't copies of his actual written work itself. It's from copies that were dictated about 200 years later. And one of the writings is called a Confessio, which was the closest to an autobiography that we have. And I'll be explaining the significance of it later. But it began with I am Patrick, a sinner, most uncultivated, and least of all the faithful, and despised in the eyes of many. So I'm going to be unpacking a lot of that. As I said, I'm going to be telling you the history. Some of you may already be familiar with Patrick through some of the legends and myths. I'm not too sure how much history you will have got. I know that for a lot of, my, even in Ireland, we didn't get a lot of the history. A lot of it was a Christian narrative, which was built on a variety of myths. So I'm going to talk about his family, and main reason for that is that his family are often left out of the picture, and I'm not going to leave them out because they're very important and significant. So who was he? Well, first thing to know, he wasn't Irish, and his name wasn't Patrick. His name, in fact, was Maewyn Sacat, and he got Patricius when he became a priest. Basically, he was made a member of the patrician order, and as a result of that, you could call yourself Patricius, and then that got translated over time into when it became anglicized into Patrick. So he was from a Romano British Christian missionary family. Uh, he was known as the Apostle of Ireland, and he's the primary patron saint of Ireland, along with Saint Bridget and Saint Columba. We're not sure where he was born, even though he mentions it in his writings. No one has ever been able to quite, establish and get agreement. Some people claim it was around Scotland in a place called Dunbarton. Some say Wales, and some even say it wasn't on the island of Britain at all, that it was in Brittany. So, but I believe it was on the west coast of Britain. That's the most likely place. His parents were Calpurnius and Conchessa, and they were part of a wealthy Romano-British family living in Britain. And at this stage, Britain had been taken over by the Romans. When Patrick was born, it was over the Romans had occupied and controlled Britain for a little over 300 years. So his father was a deacon, and his grandfather Potitus was a priest. There is evidence that some of his siblings and their offspring worked alongside him in Ireland. For example, Saint Mel of Ardagh. You may have heard of the Ardagh chalice. So Saint Mel and his brothers, Melchu, Munis, and Rioch, they actually accompanied their uncle Patrick when he came to Ireland the second time, and I'll be explaining that as I go along. Now, the most famous of them all is his sister, Dorerca. She's known as the Mother of Saints because most of her children, 17 sons and daughters, entered a religious life, and many were later recognized as saints. And several of her sons were bishops. To this day, she is honoured on the 22nd of March, and she's the patroness of Valentia Island, which is off the coast of County Kerry. Saint Mel would be, in terms of, I suppose, fame, he would be next to Dorerca. He came, as I said, with Patrick, and he helped to evangelize Ireland. And at the time, it was customary among many of the church people to support themselves through labor, although that wasn't universal. There were some who came from privileged backgrounds and wanted to live a privileged life, but they weren't likely to be the ones that would ever come to Ireland. If you wanted a handy life, an easy life, you didn't come to Ireland. Patrick appointed Mel as one of the earliest Irish bishops and made him head of the Diocese of Ardagh. Mel was also involved and instrumental in the building of the monastery of Ardagh, and he was both the bishop and abbot. And again, in Ireland we had, if you like, two kind of parallel traditions. One was one that was based around the Roman Church and diocese, and the other then was around monasteries, which was a kind of not so much a competing element within the church, but one that was distinctly appropriate for Ireland, because Ireland didn't have cities, and Ireland wasn't available to be carved up into dioceses in a way that the Romans would have been able to do in other countries. One of the things that he's famous for is that he was the one who accepted St. Bridget's profession as a nun, and he served as her mentor. Back in those days, now in ancient Gaelic society, women had, particularly women of the nobility, would have had a lot of privileges, and would have had a status, while not on a par with a man, but certainly nothing compared to the situation that women in the Middle Ages faced, when they were totally subordinate and essentially just the property of their husbands. But even in those days, it was difficult for women if they wanted to make it through the, into the church and up. In the old Celtic society, women did and could, and there was no problem making your way up the professions in old Celtic society, even to be a warrior. But anyway, when Christianity came, a lot of that changed. There was a lot of opposition to women becoming, particularly women who would become important in the church and play leading roles. So she had a difficult time being accepted, and it was Mel. He was the one who accepted her desire to be a nun and to be setting up convents and establishing orders. And in fact, some people consider the work of St. Bridget and a lot of the women that she brought into the church as possibly one of the main reasons why the church developed so rapidly in Ireland. Now, St. Mel, believe it or not, there's a feast day for him, and it's February the 7th, and it's observed as a holiday for single people. Basically a day for single people to celebrate the good things about being single. And traditions include sending yourself a St. Mel's Day card, and for people to host parties for their single friends. So now we'll get into a little bit more detail about Patrick himself. So Patrick came to Ireland as a slave, and he was there for 6 years, and he made his escape. So I'll give you the inside on that. And we know this from his own words. And according to the Confessio, that's the Latin word for confession of St. Patrick, at the age of 16, we believe around 403 AD, he was captured by Irish pirates from his home in Great Britain, and he ended up in Ireland, and he ended up as a slave herding and tending sheep in Dal Riada. He was owned by a king, a local king. Ri is the Irish word for king, Miliach MacBaun, and he ruled over some hills in County Antrim. Now, the reason that he was captured by Irish pirates has to do with the fact that in Ireland at this stage, the vast, basically, the vast bulk of people that were there were Celts. A lot of them had arrived in Ireland as a result of losing out in the war with Rome in the 500 to 1,000 years previous. So they knew what Rome was all about, what would happen to them and to Ireland if the Romans ever took it over. So their strategy to avoid that was to unite with the people in Scotland and various other people around the west coast of Europe, and they would keep the Romans busy fighting so that they didn't really have time then to come and bother people in Ireland. That's it in a nutshell. He tells us, that when he came out in the hills in all kinds of weather, he began to pray, and he tells us that this was something new. He had never before paid much attention to the teachings of his religion, and in fact, he tells us that he didn't really believe in God, and he found priests foolish, and he wasn't really setting himself up to continue in the family tradition. Here's where he was. That's Slamish or Slevemish in County Antrim. And it's up there that he spent the best part of 6 years. So, as I said, he ended up there following his capture and being brought to Ireland. And he was there from the ages of 16 to 22. And that's important because those were the years when he would have got the equivalent of his high school and college education. I mean, we're talking about 1600 years ago, but if you were a member of the elite in those days, you got educated to the highest levels, and if you wanted a career in the church, you had to get very, very well educated. And so that was a problem, and it began to be something that haunted him for the rest of his life, and nearly made it impossible for him to climb up the hierarchy within the church, because they viewed him as not fit for the job, because he hadn't got the basics in education. So anyway, he endured those 6 years, and as many of you will know, that was kind of cold and damp, and he was in isolation. And the Christian narrative tells us that on his last night as Miliach's slave, he received in his sleep his first otherworldly experience. A mysterious voice said to him, "Your hungers are rewarded. You are going home." And apparently, he tells us he walked about 200 miles to a place on the southeast coast, probably Wexford or Waterford. Now, that's the Christian narrative, but it's not the history. What really happened was, at this stage, the High King of Ireland, you may have heard of him, it was Niall of the Nine Hostages. And it was a raid involved people who worked for Niall of the Nine Hostages that were responsible for bringing Patrick to Ireland in the first place. And he didn't come alone. There were thousands of people that were kidnapped and brought to Ireland. Now, what happened around this time when Patrick escaped was that the High King, Niall, was assassinated. And he was assassinated apparently in the Alps when he was fighting the Romans. And he was assassinated by an Irishman, a prince from Leinster that had been basically stalking him for years, trying to get an opportunity to kill him. Now, Niall was not only one of the most important and strongest kings ever in Ireland, but at the time he was well known throughout Europe. So his death, which came as a big surprise, it wasn't something people were expecting. The result of that would have been political turmoil and chaos in Ireland, and there would have been a lot of people looking for opportunity. For instance, his sons, which they probably would have inherited a lot of it from him anyway, eventually. But once he was dead, they set out to take over the territory that would have been their heritage eventually. It also meant that there was a big shake-up, and it's my belief that it was in that kind of chaotic situation that Patrick was able to escape. It's also likely that he got help. There probably was the equivalent of an underground railroad in Ireland at the time. If you were kidnapped and brought to Ireland from England, the first step would have been to offer a reward or ransom. And sometimes that worked, a lot of the times it didn't. But there would have been ongoing attempts by the families and friends and communities to reach out and try to, to connect up and get you back. So there would have been, if you like, a community that would have been involved in supporting those efforts, and I'm sure they helped to get many a person out of their slavery. What we're told in terms of the Christian narrative was that he was never intercepted, stopped, or otherwise approached. And that begs the question why. And that's why I believe that he was ushered through this network. And he wouldn't have said anything about it when he was writing because, just as in this country, no one was going to write and, and pinpoint people who would help them or even acknowledge possibly the existence of something like that. He explains, and he says, "I came in God's strength and had nothing to fear." But even the Christian, some of the Christian narratives tell us that there was possibly what's described as an underground railroad. Now we do know that when he was in Ireland for the 6 years, he became fluent in the Irish language. He learnt of Irish culture and history. He figured out the political and economic conditions in Ireland and figured out how to get things done, as we'll find out later. And also, he apparently developed an affinity towards the people of Ireland to the extent that he wanted to return. At the time when he arrived at the coast, he approached the captain of a ship that had a cargo of Irish hounds that were going to the continent, probably to Rome, because Irish wolfhounds and various Irish hounds were very much wanted by the elites in Europe at the time. He initially approached the captain, but it was turned away because for anyone to take on board an escaping slave, that was a serious offence. But in the end, he tells us that the sailors came looking for him and said to him, "Come on board, we'll take you in trust." That's what we get from Patrick himself. We also know that he travelled for 3 days, and what he tells us as well is what they found was devastation. Now, some people, if you read about Patrick in some books, they'll tell you he went to England, but it doesn't take 3 days to get to England. And there's nothing in the history of that period that would explain devastation on the island of Britain. But there certainly is a good case to be made that it was to France or Spain, which would have taken about 3 days. And we know that particularly Gaul at the time, which would be modern day France and beyond, had been devastated as a result of Germanic tribes being forced westwards. And there was a few very, very cold winters, which allowed people to cross the River Rhine, and they invaded the Christianized areas. And that meant that a lot of the Christians in Gaul had to evacuate. And some of those, a considerable number probably, ended up in Ireland. So he tells us then that after about 2 weeks and finding nothing to eat, the captain taunts Patrick, "How about it, Christian? You say your God is all powerful." And Patrick tells us that he turned to him and said, "From the bottom of your heart, turn trustingly to the Lord my God, for nothing is impossible to him." And apparently the sailors bowed their heads in supplication. And with that done, a herd of pigs stampeded in front of them. So there was no way they were going to eat any of those dogs. Those dogs were more valuable than the men themselves. So you all heard the story about snakes. Well, You probably know at this stage that, again, that's a load of rubbish. There was never any snakes on Ireland, and Patrick didn't. But my take on it is this one here. Um, that when Patrick eventually left that group of people, he tells us a few things that I haven't got time to go into in detail. One is that he was actually kidnapped again, and it took him I think it was two weeks or 3 weeks to escape. But we do know then that he planned to get back to Britain, to his family, and he would have went around the coast rather than coming back across the land because it was devastated. He'd seen that. And also there was a better chance on the coast of him getting onto a boat that would bring him back to Britain. On his way, he would have come across the abbot, Honoratus, who at the time was constructing a monastery on the island of Lerins, which is in modern day Cannes, where the big film festival is. The reason that he got the land was because no one else wanted it, because it was uninhabitable. It was full of snakes and reptiles. And in one book about the place, written by Hamilton, she says Honoratus was winning a reputation for driving its booming population of vipers into the sea. And she writes that it's not impossible or unreasonable to assume that he, Patrick, might have sought refuge on Lerins. And just as an aside, if you look at the middle of that name, it's got Aaron. Now, whether that's a total coincidence or what, I don't know. But anyway, my guess is that years after when Patrick did arrive in Ireland, and as they went around working and building communities, they would have been sitting around in the evening talking. And I'm sure he had lots of stories to tell himself. And he was probably amusing people by telling him about his job on that island. And as we know in Ireland, stories just grow and grow. So there's a connection there with snakes, and it may well be how we get the story today. The one thing is for sure is that the story that we were told that he got rid of snakes in Ireland is untrue. He got rid of paganism, or he got rid of some pagans anyway. Anyway, he got home. He tells us that his family were happy to see him. They wanted him to stay there and get involved in the family business, and pleaded with him to stay and never to go again. But at this stage, within a relatively short period of time, his mind was made up. He wanted to build a future within the church. And what had happened to him up to this had changed his life forever. Sometime later, he again had another vision. And as you know from the Old Testament and New Testament and rest, it was quite common for people who became senior within the church to be able to explain a lot of things through visions. Now, today we would probably say that he was having a bout of homesickness. So anyway, this is how he describes it. This is the way Patrick describes it. I saw a man coming, as it were, from Ireland. His name was Victoricus. So he knew this person from Ireland when he had been in Ireland, and he carried many letters, and he gave me one of them. I read the heading, The Voice of the Irish. As I began the letter, I imagined in that moment that I heard the voice of those very people who were near the wood of Foclute, which is beside the Western Sea, and they cried out as with one voice, We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk with us. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Christianity in Ireland. A lot of people have been told and were led to believe that up to the time that Patrick arrived in Ireland, there was no Christians. That's not the case. That was just a simplified narrative. It avoided having to go into detail about other things, and it was a simplified story. Now, we do know certain things. There are people who believe that St. James visited Ireland in the 1st century, and that on leaving he left behind an organization to spread the religion. Now, in Ireland, St. James is very popular. Well, we know St. James's Gate, because St. James's Gate is the entrance to where Guinness is made. But from the 8th, 9th century up to probably the 12th or 13th, people met at St. James's Gate as they set off on a pilgrimage to Galicia in Spain to commemorate St. James. And he also built a hospital, which is still there today, called St. James's Hospital in Dublin. And there's at least 2 major churches in Ireland after St. James. Uh, Now, my friends in the Archbishop's house in Dublin will tell you that St. James never came to Ireland. That's the official line, but there's lots of reason to believe that he did. Now, we also know that early Irish Christianity was from the teachings of St. John, who spread the word of Christ to Africa and Asia. Um, Now, St. Paul and St. Peter were among the Christians who were based upon in Rome. And eventually, when the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, Rome became the center that everybody had to, if you like, show allegiance to. But there were differences then between the teachings of the different branches, and that was reflected in Ireland. As a result of James and John, for instance, the tonsure or the haircut that priests had was different from the one that was required from Rome. Also, the dating of Easter was different, and that was something that uh, was a very, if you like, a very lively topic within the church for hundreds of years. And just even on a kind of another note, if you like, the two most famous names in Ireland have always been Sean, August, Seamus, which is John and James, not Peter and Paul. Um, Now, there's other things as well that we get from the annals, the old Irish legends and annals. For example, at the time of Christ's death, uh, the story is that the High King at the time, Cormac MacNessa, he had a military. He had military forces in Ireland, in the Mid East, fighting against the Romans, and one of them was a prisoner of the Romans, a person called Conal Cernach, who was a military commander. And the story is that on the day that Christ was crucified, the Romans brought out a representative from every nation in the world to observe it. And this guy, Conal Cernach, was the representative of the Celts. He returned to Ireland, and he went and he informed Cormac of what happened. Cormac, hearing the story and hearing how he was already aware of who Jesus Christ was, but hearing what happened to him, he got into a fit of rage and got up and ran outside, ranting and raving. But unfortunately, Cormac had a piece of shrapnel in his head from some battle, and he loosened it, and he got a brain bleed, and he died. Um, so that's what happened to Cormac. Then another Cormac MacArt, who died in 366, he converted. It is said he converted to Christianity. The Druids weren't happy about that, and they poisoned him. And Cormac MacArt was one of the most celebrated High Kings of Ireland forever. Also, before St. Patrick arrived, there were already a number of Irish Christian leaders like Alby, Declan, Kieran, and Ibris, all of whom are now elevated to sainthood. Um, Now, some of the early Irish Christian development is explained by the relationship of Ireland to the Roman Empire. As I said earlier, the people in Ireland were Celts, and their relationship with Rome was not a good one because they had been fighting. Because before Rome was ever built, and before the Roman Empire ever became established, the Celts had been, if you like, the main group across Europe, and they were defeated in the centuries before Christ by the Romans. And they were aware of what the Romans were about, and as I said, it gave them plenty of motivation to do anything they had to do to prevent the Romans coming to Ireland. Now, the first few centuries after Christ was one of persecution of Christians, and it ceased when Constantine became emperor of Rome in 313 AD. And by about the year 250, the Christian population had risen to about 2 million, and the period from 250 to 300 was of the worst persecutions of Christians. Now, Constantine was based in Britain, and when he decided he was going to become emperor, he was going to have to fight for that. So he needed soldiers. And because he was in Britain, and the next country to him was Gaul, and they were Christianized countries, so he needed to recruit Christians. So it is my belief that in order to get those Christians to fight for him, he had to make a deal. And the deal would be that if he won, he would put an end to the persecution of Christians, and that's what happened. And eventually, long after Constantine was dead, um, although there was a dynasty because his son followed him, but eventually in the 380s, Christianity was made the official and the only religion of the Roman Empire by the emperor at that stage. And in terms of a timeline, it was around then that Patrick was born. He was born around 386, 387. Then Germanic was then sacked Rome in 410. And at that stage, then Rome had to withdraw its soldiers from Britain. And that was the last time that it did that. They had on occasion to withdraw them before, but they had always brought them back. But this was the last time that the and then in 476, Odoacer forced the last Western emperor to abdicate. Now, it was in 380 then with the Edict of Thessalonica made what was initially Nicene Christianity, because one of the things that Constantine had done was brought together all of the Christians at Nicene, which was the first council of the church, and all after that. And at that stage, they just called Christianity the Nicene. But in 386, they introduced the term Catholic, which meant universal, and from it was instead of being Nicene Christianity, it became Catholic. Um, and that provided the impetus leaders at home dance various branches of the church around the world. They had the means now with which to do. They were allowed to work within all of the state federal bodies. So they had a lot of power, which they didn't have for the first 3 centuries. One of the events that happened before came to Ireland a few years before it, in 429, the Pope Saint Germanus to Britain to ensure compliance there with Roman authority, because even though the Roman Empire had adopted the church in Rome, there were still other branches of the church, if you like, competing. And in England, there was a variant which Rome wanted to get rid of. So Germanus's job was to come and put it to the Christians there that you are going to have to agree with he had a deal, for in terms of the way forward. And so it looks like the majority agreed with his deal. Those that didn't were sent into exile, and some of those would have come to Ireland. So if we look at who were the Christians in Ireland at this stage, and this stage we're talking about around the time that Patrick. So some of them would have been those exiles talked about. Some would have been slaves brought to Ireland. If there were slaves that were captured in Britain and Gaul, they would have been mainly Christians. There's the possibility also that Irish mercenary soldiers fighting for Rome, and there were some who were fighting against Rome, they may have converted while fighting away. There was trading going on, and maybe some of those as well converted. And then there was people in Ireland who had been converted by the missionaries that predated Patrick. Then we had, as a result of the Germanic tribes invading the Christianized Gaul, there would have been a lot of people who were forced out and would have arrived in Ireland. Some of them as refugees, and some of them as asylum seekers. And they brought a lot of resources to Ireland. They brought skills, and in fact, the population of Ireland around that time grew to its highest level that wasn't surpassed for another 1400 years. Also, in the centuries that followed, in the 6th, 7th, and 8th century, Ireland was known as the island of saints and scholars. Ireland had a renaissance, while the rest of Europe, which was decimated by the Germanic tribes coming in, and that period in Europe is known as the Dark Ages, but in Ireland we had a renaissance. So now I'm going to look at how Patrick converted the Irish, and there's a couple of quotes. In terms of his own perception of how he was going to get on, he says, "Daily I am expecting to be slain or set upon or reduced to slavery." Now, Cardinal Cushing, many of you may remember Cardinal Cushing from his days in Boston. In his book, he talks about this period, and he says it was in an era of alarming crisis that Pope Celestine I sent Patrick to Ireland, an era of confusion and disorder and chaos. And that's precisely what I've been describing to you there. It was the Europe that Patrick found when he landed as he escaped from slavery. It was the Ireland from which a lot of refugees and asylum seekers came. And there was also difficulties and problems with inside the church itself. And of course, the Roman Empire itself was in what we would talk about now as a terminal decline. So, what was Patrick's role then? Why did they send him? Well, first of all, the year before, they had sent somebody else because Patrick still hadn't managed to convince them that he was entitled, if you like, to do the job. His background as such and his education didn't really qualify him, and a lot of people put up blockages to him uh, ever reaching any kind of high levels within the church. Now, Palladius came and it failed. And Patrick, again, at this stage, would have made one last effort to get in, basically saying something along the lines, look, no one else is going to be able to do this job. If it's going to be done by anybody, it's going to be done by me. I can speak their language. I know people over there. I know how to get on with them. I know the way things work there. And it worked. He was sent. Now, what was his job? Well, his primary role was to align the Christian community in Ireland with Rome, because as I pointed out to you there, at this stage there was a mishmash of Christians within Ireland at a time when Rome was trying to assert its domination and to, if you like, require that people align themselves with Rome. So the last thing that Rome wanted was a Christian community establishing itself in Ireland, which was outside of the Roman Empire. And I'll get back to that in a moment, because Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire. So they didn't want a Christian community anywhere that could challenge the dominance of Rome. So it was strategic sending Patrick there. That was his job. It's often said in some books that he was sent to Ireland to strengthen the local Irish Christian community. So you have to read between the lines to figure out what they were saying. And as I said, the community was a mix of converted Irish, Christian slaves, Christian refugees, and asylum seekers. So he spent about 20 years preparing for his role in the church. Because of his missing out on his education, he was initially assigned to the role as a brother. He finally was made a priest and then made a bishop as a result of his successful, pleading his case to be sent to Ireland. Now, the issue was, as I said, in 2 years before, or 2 or 3 years before Patrick arrived, St. Germanus had been sent to Britain with a deal. Now, part of that deal, Rome had to recognize certain things about the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain. And one of the things that Rome agreed with them was that if they were ever to send somebody to Ireland, they would have to get approval from the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain. Now, even though that was only a kind of rubber stamping operation in one sense, it did give them a certain amount of power, and Patrick had to go and meet and put his case and get rubber stamped to come to Ireland. So at one level, the British ecclesiastical authorities were able to claim then that because of their intermediary position or whatever, that they in fact were the ones who were in control of Patrick and his mission in Ireland. To give you an idea of what was involved in his work, when he arrived in any community in Ireland, he brought with him a group consisting of never less than 24 people, often up to 100. Now, the group would include an assistant bishop, a chaplain, several men that Patrick was preparing for a priesthood, a brehon or judge to advise him on legal matters, builders, masons, smiths, metalworkers, chariot and wagon drivers, a cook, and most importantly, a brewer, and 2 table attendants, and also a sacristan, 3 embroidery workers to prepare the linens, and a palmist. Now, it's thought that he supplemented his church resources with some personal and family wealth, although we're not sure about that. But we do know, and he says it himself in his work, that wealthy Irish nobility, particularly women, provided resources for his work. And this was something that got him into trouble with the ecclesiastical authorities in England, because when they confronted him about it, he basically said, "I never took anything from them." But that's not what the ecclesiastical authorities wanted. They basically wanted him to take it, and they wanted him to divvy it up with them. Because their problem with Patrick in Ireland eventually was that he wasn't sending revenue over to them. He was using it to build his mission in Ireland, and they did not like that. Anyway, there's a couple of people that you might have read. One is Cahill, who wrote the book How the Irish Saved Civilization. So he again tells us, because of Patrick's knowledge of the Irish language and culture, that was what was on his CV, if you like, that allowed him to be sent. Also, he started in Northern Ireland, and one of the reasons for that was that the other Christian ministers that I mentioned earlier on, Declan and Kieran and the rest, they were located in the south, and they were not that happy with Patrick coming. They did not like an outsider being imposed on them. So when Patrick went to, particularly to Munster and Leinster, he could only go by permission and by invitation, because as far as they were concerned, this is our territory. So there was internal squabblings in Ireland at the time. Now, he would have got and sought permission from local kings to minister to Christians in the given area, because at this time all the land was owned by clans. So if once you landed and set foot on land in Ireland, you were on somebody's land. So you had to get permission to do your work. Otherwise, you could end up losing everything. He would have sought assistance of local kings then to move beyond the tribal borders, using family connections or whatever. He also converted some kings. At this stage, there would have been about 150 kings in Ireland, because there was kings at a local level, at a slightly higher level, then at a provincial level. There was a whole hierarchy of kings. Another book was written by Freeman, who suggested Patrick succeeded by using a slow and steady approach with a careful eye on the practical politics of Irish society. And what that means is things like making payments to local kings to gain their favour and protection. And we know that that's true because Patrick tells us he knew that that's what you had to do. And again, the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain did not like that. He chose not to be confrontational or dogmatic. And above all, he wanted to demonstrate that Christian morality and principles worked, and that he applied them. Because there were many people in Ireland who were just waiting for this whole thing to collapse some way or another. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. So he had to be very careful, and he knew that he was being scrutinized. Now, we know that Patrick, along with other Christian missionaries, they managed to spread Christian teachings through things like preaching, writing, and performing countless baptisms. Now, one of the things that helped him in this spread was the fact that the pagan religions already related to transcendentalism. So again, in explaining the transcendental element, of the church, it wasn't a concept that was new to the Irish. So he was able to, he understood how we could use that. He also recognized the history of spiritual practices in place in Ireland, the kind of nature-oriented rituals, and a lot of those were incorporated into church practices. And one of the most obvious ways that we see that today is in Patrick's Celtic cross. It's renowned for coming up. He combined native sun worshipping with the Christian. So that meant to people, he is not trying to wipe out our history. He's incorporating that. Now, there are accounts, unfortunately, that Patrick did consign to the flames 150 volumes of written works belonging to the pagans. And I, along with many other people, would love to see what was in those. Sad day when those were burnt. So what were his achievements? Well, he established bishops throughout the northern, central, and eastern Ireland. As I said, he was restricted from going to Munster in the south. He structured the church then by locating bishops close to the sites of provincial kings. The borders of dioceses then had to be arranged to correspond with boundaries of the petty kingdoms. So again, what he had to do there was, instead of taking out a map and deciding where the diocese would be, he essentially had to accept that whatever lines I draw on this are the lines that are already there. The effect of this then was that every clan had to have their own church, they had to have their own priests, and the tradition in Ireland was any important positions had to be hereditary. Um, and in this case, over time, it was the same within the church, and that then became a problem for Rome for hundreds and hundreds of years, trying to back out of that. Um, Now, he himself was the primatial or the highest ranking bishop in Ireland, seated at Armagh. Um, and the claim that Armagh has to be the primary seat within Ireland has always rested in after that with the fact that Armagh was the centre set up by Patrick, because Cashel and Dublin at different times fought and wanted to be the centre and the seat, of Ireland. So even to today, you have a situation where the Archbishop of Dublin is known as the Archbishop of Ireland, and in Armagh, he's the Archbishop of all Ireland. So again, the finer points of this, I'd love to go into it in detail with you sometime, but it took hundreds of years uh, for for the people in Munster to accept that it wasn't going to be Cashel, because that was where they were hoping would be accepted as the primary seat in Ireland. And it took hundreds of years for them to agree to Armagh. Then hundreds of years after that, again, then Dublin. After Dublin City was developed, Dublin wanted that role, and again, that was fought out for a long time too. Now, one of the significant things about it was that there were no church martyrs at this time, which is very, very unusual. Now, at the same time, the threat was always there, because Patrick says himself that on more than one occasion he alludes to persecution. He declares that he expects martyrdom, and he welcomes the prospect. And in the first 4 or 5 centuries in Europe, Christians expected martyrdom, and a lot of them welcomed it because they knew that martyrdom meant an instant reward in terms of ending up in heaven. That was what they believed. Now, it's clear that by the time of his death, so he arrived in Ireland when he was around 46, 47, and he died 72 or 73. So he had about 25 years. So he hadn't succeeded in converting the whole of Ireland, nor in reconciling all of the secular authorities to Christianity. Now, the main Christian narrative of Ireland is that by the time that he died, that he had achieved all of that, but it's not the case. Again, it was a simplification, but I tried to teach history. He supported in his work church officials, he created councils, he founded monasteries, and he did organize Ireland into dioceses. But again, the dioceses were essentially boundaries that he wasn't able to impose upon people. One of the effects of his work was that by the 6th century, there were church laws laid down, and it laid down a code of conduct for Christians towards their pagan neighbors. So it wasn't like we have to convert everybody or get rid of them. That was not the case. There was respect for people, and that was put down as in a code of conduct. So according to Cardinal Cushing, within the 25 years, the whole of Ireland was Catholic, which, as I said, wasn't the case. What is true is that he consecrated 350 bishops. I don't think anyone really disagrees with that. He ordained over 5,000 priests, and he built more than 700 churches. So that would have meant a huge building boom within Ireland, and would have had major economic impacts at the time. Now I'm going to look at his writings. The first writing was, it's titled A Letter to the Soldiers of Coroticus. Now, Coroticus was a king on the island of Britain. And what happened was Patrick had just been up to a place on the northeast coast of Ireland, and he had just baptized a whole village and people from the surrounding areas. And he was heading off then somewhere else. And he wasn't gone that long when a messenger caught up with him to notify him that the people that he had just baptized were now taken away by the soldiers of Caractacus to Britain as slaves. So Patrick had to do something about it. Um, he knew that the people in Ireland were looking, and this was, in one sense, this was a test to see how we would respond to this. So he wrote a letter to the soldiers, and one of the people who've written about it describes the letter as at once a decree of excommunication, a heartfelt plea, a carefully argued sermon, a word of comfort to his Irish followers, and a powerful prayer to God for divine justice. Now, copies were sent not just to Caractacus, but to church leaders in Britain and fellow Christians in Ireland. So the issue was this created enormous problems for Patrick. He was in a no-win situation. If he chose to ignore it and plead that I can't do anything, well, that wasn't going to go down well with his supporters in Ireland. The protocol at the time was that he should have contacted the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain and asked them to intervene. But he knew that that would take too long, first of all, because he knew that within weeks, all of the people would have been dispersed throughout the world. Um, so he had a short window, if you like, to do something. Um, he also knew, quite likely, that the local ecclesiastical authorities in the area that Caractacus lived in probably relied upon Caractacus for their personal security. So he knew that they were probably not going to do a whole lot about it. So that's why he wrote the letter. And that then developed because from that point there was already issues about his mission in Ireland, and I suppose in one sense the Church in England saw him as having gone native. And he wasn't heeding their calls to do things their way. So he was already, having some difficulties that way. This letter then just gave them the opportunity, because now he had clearly overstepped the mark, and so they 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 wanted to call him, to account, and that's what they did. Sometime later, they called him, sent him a message calling him back to England for a review. Now he knew that if he went for that review, that they would never let him back. He was in his 70s, and it was probably common knowledge at the time that there was somebody already set up to come from Britain to take over. So he refused to go, and he wrote a letter, and that letter we know today is the Confessio. It's accepted also that it was the work of St. Patrick. And as I said, it didn't have a title. Then we know it by the final line in the letter, because he writes that the letter is his confessio, or confession, before death. So here's again the reasons why he wrote it. The church were angry over the letter to the soldiers. He was called back to England for a review. His character and work were attacked viciously. He was accused of corruption, of having ulterior motives in coming to Ireland, was stated to be unfit for the job, and that was because of his lack of, the education. In other words, his Latin was not of the standard that was normally required within the church. His debating skills, his oratorical skills, his knowledge of the history of the church, there was quite a lot that he had missed out on, obviously. So also they saw him as being too close to the Irish. In other words, he had gone native, and they called him a filthy little pig keeper. That's what. So anyway, the story, essentially, to give it to you in a nutshell, it's a selective story, and it's designed to show that he was chosen by the grace of God to serve selflessly among the Irish. And he recounts his boyhood, his slavery, his escape, his dreams, the threats, temptations, all of that are included to convince the readers that he, like the Apostle Paul, was selected by God and guided by him in his work. And he says it very well in this here. And this, you could read through this and pick out an awful lot, and I'll explain some of it as I go through. So he says, listen to me well, all of you, great and small, everyone who has any fear of God, especially you wealthy landowners, so proud of your education. So he's getting a dig in there, because their problem with him was his lack of education. He says, listen and consider carefully. God chose foolish little me from among all of you who seem so wise and so expert in the law and so powerful in your eloquence. He picked ignorant Patrick ahead of all of you, even though I am not worthy. He picked me to go forth with fear and reverence, and without any of you complaining at the time, to serve the Irish faithfully. So he was saying there at the end about the complaining at the time. What he was saying was that you guys, you didn't give me a chance of success. You thought I'd be dead within weeks, or that, like Palladius, that I would be running scared and out of that country before the day was done. And now that I've been successful, you want to basically take it all from me. So he died in Saul in Downpatrick. It wasn't called Downpatrick when he was alive. Um, that didn't happen until the Normans came to Ireland, and a fella called John de Courcy took over the northeast coast of Ireland. And in taking it over, he did some things that put him in the bad books of the church. Like he kidnapped people from the church, took them into captivity, um, and eventually released them. But anyway, he decided he had to make amends, and what he did was he decided on this area, um, and which was where it was reputed that Patrick had been buried, and he called it after Patrick, Downpatrick. And then he sent out people to get any the relics, if you like, of Saint Bridget and Saint Columba, and put them all together. And this was his kind of gift to the church to make amends, and it worked. So I'm going to now go into some of the St. Patrick's Day celebrations and his legacy. Um, so I'm going to give them essentially in a kind of a chronological order. So the first thing we know is that when he was here in 441, he went on a 40-day night pilgrimage on what was called Eagle Mountain in County Mayo at the time. Now it's called Croagh Patrick after him, but it was Eagle Mountain for ever before that. And every year, thousands of Christians make the ascent, some barefoot, to commemorate the original pilgrimage. Now, the celebrations then, as far as we know, began in the 9th century by Irish scholars who travelled to the continent, and they are the ones that are credited with starting it. Now, many of these were fleeing Ireland as the Viking invasion started and continued, and they arrived in Europe as refugees and asylum seekers. And Patrick then became a symbol of Ireland for all of those in exile. We know that when the Vikings invaded Ireland, they attacked all of the church properties, the monasteries, settlements, kidnapping people to sell as slaves, taking mobile wealth, and destroying the Christian heritage. The Vikings, one of their main motivations for that was because, we had Charlemagne, who was the King of France, and he was given the job as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And one of his first tasks was to Christianize the rest of Europe. And he basically came out with an edict. And the edict to people in Western Europe was, you got two choices. One is conversion, and the other is execution. The Vikings were not happy with that. And that, to a large extent, explains why the Vikings, when they came to Ireland and various other parts where there was a Christian tradition, it explains why they set about destroying that Christian tradition. Now, very shortly after they came in, because Ireland wasn't an urban society, so you had to find places where people gather in large numbers. And they realized pretty quick that there were certain days of the year where people gathered in large numbers to celebrate their saints, like Patrick, like Bridget, and the rest. And the Vikings then realized that they could raid those places, and they did, making off at times with thousands of Irish for the slave markets. Now, many Christians left Ireland for the safety of Europe, and then an annual tradition sprung up amongst them. And in the 9th century, in Ireland itself, there was an annual 3-day observance of the anniversary of the death of St. Patrick, and there was readings then which were read and continued over the 3 days. Then his feast day was placed on the universal liturgical calendar in the Catholic Church, uh, uh, due to the influence of Luke Wadding, who was a Franciscan scholar, and this was in the early 1600s. And St. Patrick's Day then became a holy day of obligation for Roman Catholics in Ireland. It's also a feast day in the Church of Ireland, which is part of the Anglican Communion. Now, until the 1700s, St. Patrick's Day was celebrated predominantly in Ireland, but there were other parts of Europe where it was a somber religious occasion spent mainly in prayer and not a drop of drink anywhere. From the 18th century onward, then, as a result of the penal laws in Ireland, some Irish people began to use St. Patrick's Day as a means of promoting Irish culture and tradition. Essentially, it was an act of defiance because during the penal laws, essentially, if you were Irish, you were criminalized, and any action or any activity that showed that you wanted to celebrate your history and your culture could you could lose your life over it. But because St. Patrick was common, to the various churches, it was one of those situations where they were able to take advantage of it. And the authorities had to kind of, look at it and ignore it essentially. But for the Irish people, it was a way in which they could display an act of defiance against the English. And they began wearing shamrocks because, again, at the time, if you wore any symbol related to Ireland, you could lose your freedom of your life. But again, because it was St. Patrick's Day, they began wearing the shamrock and they were able to get away with it. Now, the colour green then was further associated with Ireland from the 1640s when the green harp flag was used by the Irish Catholic Confederation, which ruled Ireland for about 8 or 9 years in the 1640s. Green ribbons and shamrocks then have been worn on St. Patrick's Day since at least the 1680s. And then the Friendly Brothers of St. Patrick, which is an Irish fraternity that was founded in 1750, they adopted green as its colour because the original colour associated with Patrick was actually blue. Then in 1903, St. Patrick's Day became an official public holiday in Ireland. Under the Bank Holiday Act of 1903, it was introduced. Also, the person who introduced it, James O'Mara, he later introduced a law which required that public houses be shut on 17th of March after the drinking got out of hand. But by the 70s, that had to be repealed because people wanted to drink again. Then parades, well, the first St. Patrick's Day parade in Ireland was held in Waterford in 1903. And then in 1916, some of you will know that in 1916 we had the Easter Rebellion. So again, as happened, during the penal law times, people had to find, I suppose, an imaginative and innovative way in which you could actually get out onto the streets and parade and show your Irishness. So in 1916, the Irish Volunteers that led the Easter Rebellion, they held parades throughout Ireland, but got away with them on the basis that they were celebrating St. Patrick. And the authorities recorded 38 St. Patrick's Day parades involving 6,000 marchers, and almost half of them were said to have been armed. The first official state-sponsored St. Patrick's Day parade in Dublin took place in 1931. And then in terms of, this side of the world, obviously Irish immigrants brought St. Paddy's Day to the United States. It is said that the first civic and public celebration of St. Patrick's Day took place in Boston in 1737. Now, some recent research suggests that the world's first recorded St. Patrick's Day celebration was in St. Augustine in the year 1600. And that's according to research that's been done by Dr. Michael Franesis. He discovered the first St. Patrick's Day parade was also in St. Augustine in 1601. Both were organized by the Spanish colony's Irish vicar, Ricardo Arter, or Richard Arter. Many believe still that the first meeting of Irishmen on American soil to honor St. Patrick took place in Boston on the 17th of March in 1737, and then Boston had its first parade in 1812. Now, it was in New York City that the first parade took place, and it took place in 1762 when Irish soldiers that were serving with the British Army marched through Manhattan to a local tavern. Now, the first celebration of St. Patrick's Day in New York City was held at the Crown and Thistle Tavern in 1756. And in 1780, General George Washington, who commanded soldiers of Irish descent in the Continental Army, he allowed his troops a holiday on March the 17th. That event became known as the St. Patrick's Day Encampment of 1780. Now known as the Evacuation Day, March 17, 1776, it saw the withdrawal of British troops and loyalists from the Boston Harbor after a siege for 11 months. Now, Washington's general orders for the day set the password and countersign for safe re-entry into the city as Boston and St. Patrick. So by the late 1860s, over a dozen American cities had large St. Patrick's Day parades, and then just 10 years later, the Irish by the 1870s were the majority in the population in New York. And obviously, not surprisingly, it was largely due to the American Day celebrated in the world. Where the Irish connection is slight. Now, one of the, I suppose, one of the events that happened that, you know, just it signifies so much ill will and whatever, had to do with St. Patrick's Crozier. In Irish, it's known as An Bacall Isa. It was made of wood, and legend tells us that it was given to him when he was in the Holy Land. And it was given to him, and the legend is that it was actually a staff that that Jesus Christ had used himself. Now, some of the ancient books in Ireland, like the Annals of Ulster and the Annals of the Four Masters, say it was a symbol of Patrick's authority. Now, he himself then took the original piece of wood, and he had an elaborate casing made for it by his companion, the goldsmith Assicus, who then became a saint afterwards, Saint Tussock. So eventually, this, you know, because initially it was just a staff of just wood, and over time, then it got upgraded, if you like. So it was described by the famous Saint Bernard of Clairvaux as it was covered with gold and adorned with the most costly gems, and it was a national relic. And things like oaths and treaties then were signed on it. And it survived for a long time. It survived storms, it survived the Viking invasions. But then during the Reformation, it was sacrilegiously destroyed in Dublin. It was taken out of Christ Church, and it was burnt in public in front of the church in Dublin. Just one or two things. The only nation then outside of Ireland that celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a national holiday is Montserrat. In the West Indies. Was first populated by Irish and African slaves deported there beginning in the 1650s. It's nicknamed the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean because of its physical shape, which some say resembles Ireland, and of course because of its Irish heritage. So earlier on in the beginning, I said that I teach some history classes. So March and April, and I have courses that started last week, and one of them is on St. Patrick. It's a 4-week course which goes into a lot more detail about the events than I could go into tonight. I don't have a website, so that's my email address there. Now there's the 4 weeks, 4 Thursdays in March. So I do, one of the programs that I have is a history of every county in Ireland. I do one a month. So I'm doing County Cork at the moment, and then I do a chronological history of Ireland, although I made a segue in March to do the arrival of Christianity and the role of St. Patrick. And they're all on Zoom, similar to what I'm doing right now. Then in April, the next county that I'm going to be dealing with is County Sligo. And then I'm getting back to the chronological history, which is at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, the flight of the Earls and the plantation of Ulster. If any of you, as I said, want a copy of this, you can get movies about St. Patrick by searching online. I've got some of them listed here. There's also a kids movie. So I'm going to go back now to I'll get back to you, and I'll take any questions or any comments that any of you have. So if there's anything I can help you with.
Right, Sean, that was really, really wonderful. So if anybody wants to put a question into the chat, please go ahead and do so. In the meantime, when you mentioned Crow Patrick, it reminded me about, close to 20 years ago now, my wife was over in Ireland, and she ascended it, and was left with not only an impression of a great view when she reached the top, but like awed that some people climb it barefoot.
Yes.
It just such an amazing thing. Um, I was curious, actually, for myself. Palladius, you mentioned as someone who failed in his attempt when going into Ireland. I was curious, how many attempts did they make, and maybe some of the reasons why he failed. It seemed that maybe part of it was to do with St. Patrick knowing the language, and Palladius just maybe not having the same level of preparation.
Yeah, it was partly that, but also Patrick, having been a slave in Ireland, he had a different approach on life. He was more hands-on. One of the movies that was made in 1999 about St. Patrick, which is well worth listening. It's a Hollywood movie, but it does a few things that are good, and one of them is about Saint Palladius. And what it shows is, Saint Palladius, coming in all his attire, getting off the boat with all these servants around him, and then he has to walk up to where the Irish are, and his feet are getting mucky, and he's looking down, and he's getting disgusted with all of this, and the Irish are just laughing at him, you know, and basically, that was it. He was not a person that they could ever relate, to. Um, so the story is anyway that he didn't get on with the Irish people, he didn't get on with the Christians that were there, and he gave up and had to be replaced. That's there are different stories, because again we can't go back to look at the headlines in the papers, or but that certainly looks like what happened. That's the most that's the story that's told most. Some people actually say that Palladius did stay 10 or 20 years in Ireland, and then Patrick came later, but there's really, the evidence doesn't support that as far as I'm concerned.
Interesting. I was also curious about the Confessio. It seemed like it was very politically kind of a thing that maybe the church wasn't excited about being out there. And is that the right? Am I getting the right impression?
Well,
That
the problem was, the Roman Church couldn't ignore the fact that this island, had now a substantial, and a growing Christian population as a result of essentially the Germanic tribes coming in, and the Roman Empire being under siege. So a lot of them were going there because it was a safe place to go, relatively safe anyway. So the fact that Ireland had never been part of the Roman Empire would have meant that no one had prioritized going to Ireland. So the fact that a decision was taken to send somebody there is proof positive, that there was substantial activity going on in Ireland that required that form of intervention. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. It was a totally different intervention than was happening, throughout Europe. So there were concerns that, particularly given that numbers of people had been forced out of Britain by the British ecclesiastical authorities, because there were still battles going on over things like original sin, and also the Christian group that essentially were active in Britain, or at least some of them, were ones who were not happy with the way that the Christian church was developing across Europe, because it was centered among the elites.
Hmm.
And what they were basically saying was, we don't actually need to go down and get our feet dirty. All we have to do is to go to these big dinners, convince all these people with power to become Christians, and they just tell all of their workers and all of the people who are working on their lands, you're now a Christian. And whereas a lot of people saw that as a total destruction of the basic Christian ideal, because the Christian ideal was from just basically ordinary people who went out, and got themselves, martyred for hundreds of years. And now there's all these people, in very, very powerful positions, within the Roman Empire. And again, if you look at the history of the Roman Empire, I mean, who killed Jesus Christ? You know, who was responsible for his death?
Hmm.
You know, so there was a lot of stuff going on that made people unsure about. And of course, in Ireland, the issue as well was, is this Rome coming in the back door? You know, we've managed for hundreds of years to ensure that the Roman armies never made it, to Ireland. And now we have this new formed, thing emanating from Rome that's coming in and telling us how to think and how to believe. So again, there was substantial issues there in terms of how you could manage to convert Ireland, given the historic antagonism there would have been to Rome. But unfortunately, we don't have enough material to explain how that transitioned and how it transitioned in such a short period of time. It does lead credence to the fact that there must have been a lot of people coming in from Europe who are Christians, and a lot of people with resources, who were able to use those resources to get a lot of the local chieftains in Ireland on their sides and get them, because that system seems to have worked well in Ireland. If you convert the local chieftains, uh, there was a more symbiotic relationship in Ireland between the clan chieftains and the members of the clan. And to some extent, for a clan chieftain to accept Christianity, there would have had to be a kind of a process that would have required that they get the approval, of their people for that. So it wasn't like what was happening, in typically in Rome, where the leaders of society could adopt it and then essentially then dictate to people. In Ireland, it was different, because you couldn't take the chance that that your clan would disown you, so you had to make sure you had them on board.
And then you did mention the hereditary nature of some of that. You said was a bit of an issue too.
Yeah, in Ireland, under the old Celtic system, essentially there was an approach that there were very very important jobs that needed to be done. Um, and the way to ensure that those got done was to have those jobs in families for generations after generations. And so those families then relied, for their prestige, for their continued existence upon doing a good job. Um, and you had a huge responsibility, to ensure, whether it was in the field of law, whether it was in the sciences, whatever field it was in. And the same with the Druids, the leaders of the Druids as well. There was this kind of continuity, which was not something that Rome wanted,
Mm.
because again they wanted to break up local structures so
Mhm.
that they could control it from the corporate headquarters.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. We did actually have a request in our chat for your email for your courses again.
Okay. Let me just put that up. Let me see where we are, and then I can take any questions. Now there it is.
Okay, perfect.
If you can read it, it's Sean Murphy 630 at gmail.com.
Um, I'm not seeing any other questions come in, but I do like, I always like to ask a couple questions of our guests. One, you did list some resources for people that might be interested in learning more. Is there any, and I think those were movies. You mentioned a movie from the 90s. Do you remember the title of that offhand?
I think it's just St. Patrick.
Oh, okay, okay.
And you've got, like, you probably would recognize Savannah York. Some people might remember Savannah York. She was in it. That was Patrick's mother. Then Patrick himself was Emmett Bergen, who's a famous Irish actor. He's done some work over here, but he never really made it in the States like Liam Neeson and some of the others. But he would have been before Liam Neeson to some extent and some of the other famous Irish actors here. But it had a good cast. Again, the story was a mix of legend, Hollywood flamboyance, and enough history to, so that it wasn't total fluff.
And then the last question I have would be, during your research on St. Patrick, is there anything that stood out as being surprising, like especially surprising about him?
Um, well, I suppose the most surprising thing was, his own, personal connection. He was probably the only one, at the time within the church that would have had that connection, which was built upon his experience with the Irish and having been brought and worked, as a slave. Um, and But again, he was also at the time, he would have been one of the people who was literally interpreting, the scriptures as well. And at the time, Ireland was the outpost of the world, and he was interpreting some of the scriptures, which talked about, bringing, that certain things could only happen, if you like, when the Christian word was brought, to the ends of the earth.
Mhm.
So he saw himself fulfilling a mission, with and ensuring the completion, of something that had been written about and prophesized. So again, he was motivated, by that, and to some extent, maybe that was more. But certainly, he had to fight a hard battle to get accepted within the church, because of his lack of education. Um, and he succeeded at that. So he was very resilient. Then also the fact that he really only succeeded by convincing enough people that there was sufficient, if you like, alignment between what people believed in Ireland at the time and what the word of Jesus Christ was. So he was able to, to bring people together and one of the things that he did was he set up a commission, in Ireland to look at all of the ancient written works of Ireland, and he brought people in then from the oral tradition. So some of the works that we have that recount the pre-patrician times in Ireland comes from that effort that he made, and that showed that he was able to get, the main leaders of Ireland together, because it was a committee of nine and was a very prestigious committee. It was made up of three kings, three, if you like, doctors of different sciences, and three other people. So it was a very prestigious committee. But unfortunately, what he did was, he was the chairman, so he did a lot of editing. So anything that didn't fit directly within the Christian narrative was removed. So, and unfortunately, we don't have any of, we don't have a set of the initial documents that were presented for consideration. We just have the final one. So there was a lot of things that, we'd love to know about that, that, well,
Yeah.
we're never going to know now.
Well, I think that'll do it for us. Nothing coming through in the chat, but what a wonderful presentation again, Sean. We're really happy that you were able to come and speak with us tonight. There's the email again to help register for the classes.
Or if you
Um,
have any questions, if you have any questions, my classes continue all year round, and constantly doing. And I'm trying to set up a website at the moment as well, so that I can put some of these on to make them available to people. But anyway, thank you very much for inviting me, and um, I wish you all happy St. Patrick's Day, and hopefully this time next year we'll all be able to get out in the streets and celebrate in the old way.
Absolutely. Well, yeah.